You're watching Noir Street. I'm your host, Nero Wolfe. Every story hides a secret, and every shadow hides a clue. Tell us where in the world you're watching from. Subscribe, tap the like button, and join us as we drift into mystery. Chapter 1. The Room of Quiet Things on a Tuesday morning in March, when New York had turned cold without having the decency to snow. I was at my desk in the office on the ground floor of the old brownstone on West 35th Street, trying to impose order on a stack of correspondence. Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms with his orchids, where he regarded time, weather, and the human race as nuisances to be endured between 10 and 11 and again, between 4 and 6. Fritz was in the kitchen, and from the drift of smell under the office door, I judged he was building a luncheon with one of those sauces that make a man forgive civilization. The bell rang. He looked at the clock. 10:32. Wolfe would no more come down before 11 than he would dance on the roof. I got up, crossed the hall, and opened the front door. The woman on the stoop wore a dark coat, gloves the color of old ivory, and the kind of hat that announces it was bought because it was right. Not because it was pretty. She wasn't pretty anyway, which was no disadvantage. Too composed for that. Too steady in the eyes. Somewhere around 40, with the face of a woman who had long ago discovered that disappointment is only dangerous when you act surprised by it. "Yes," I said. "I wish to see Nero Wolfe." "Everyone does. Some even admit it. Your name, Julia Riddle." That name settled at once. In New York, a coincidence is never impossible, but when a woman named Riddle arrives to discuss a death on Riddle Street, something is trying too hard. "Come in," I said. "Mr. Wolfe is occupied. I am Archie Goodwin." She stepped inside, glanced once around the hall, once at me, and gave each glance exactly the time required. I took her to the office. She sat in the red leather chair near my desk without fidgeting, which put her ahead of most clients and half the murderers. "What can we do for you?" I asked. "My cousin, Martin Vale, was killed yesterday afternoon." "That would be the Martin Vale of Riddle Street." "Yes. The papers say he kept certain things for certain people. They say more than they know." Her tone was dry enough to preserve fruit. "He kept objects and papers for people who did not wish to keep them at home and did not trust a bank. A discreet warehouse. He called it a service." "And you called it?" She met my eyes. "Squalid." That had weight, because she didn't bother polishing it. I nodded. "You weren't fond of him. Numbered, did he know?" "Yes." "That helps. Saves tribute. Go on." She folded her gloves once in her lap. "Yesterday at noon, Martin telephoned me. He said he had discovered something and must speak to me at once. He asked me to come at 5. His tone was unusual. "Frightened?" "Yes." "Had you heard him frightened before?" "Number." "What then?" "I arrived at his house a little after 5:20. I rang. There was no answer. The door was unlocked. I went in, called his name, and received none. In a room at the back of the ground floor, I found him lying beside a cabinet. He was dead. There was blood near his head. I telephoned the police. You touched nothing. Numbered, did you notice anything in the room?" "Yes." She hesitated, not from uncertainty but distaste. "It was full of the things he kept. Small things, rings, envelopes, keys, packets, boxes, and there was a metal bowl with burned papers in it. You think one of those little treasures got him killed?" "I think the police will think so. I am not sure they are right." "Why not?" "Because Martin was not important enough to die for a scandal. He was merely useful." That was good. I was still turning it over when footsteps sounded in the hall. Nero Wolfe entered the office wearing yellow silk pajamas from the plant rooms and an expression that suggested the world had overreached again. He stopped, saw the client, saw me, and placed responsibility where it belonged. "Archie." "She brought a corpse," I said. "I thought you might want one. Ipfu." His gaze shifted to the woman. "Madam, sit. State your business." Mr. Goodwin will interrupt when his vanity compels him. Julia Riddle repeated the essentials. Wolfe sat behind his desk with his eyes half closed, fingertips together, not moving except once when she described the cabinet of deposited objects, and again when she mentioned the burned papers. When she finished, he opened his eyes all the way. "You disliked your cousin," he said. "Yes. Yet you come to me." "Why?" "Because the police will go hunting for melodrama. Martin lived among private embarrassments. They will assume one of them turned theatrical. I think the cause may be smaller." "No cause is small to a corpse," Wolfe said. "Did your cousin ever blackmail anyone?" "I don't know." "That means yes, perhaps. That means I don't know." He implied he could influence people. "Influence," Wolfe muttered. A respectable word. Was he wealthy? Moderately. He lived comfortably, better than his beginnings would suggest. What were his beginnings? Poor. Wolfe turned to me. "Archie, you will go to Riddle Street. See the room. Speak to the police if they cannot prevent it. Learn who last saw Martin Vale alive, what was burned, whether anything is missing, and whether he kept a list of clients, a list of opportunities. Men such as Vale enumerate their leverage." He looked back at Julia Riddle. "If I accept this matter, it is not to rescue your cousin's reputation. He has none. It is to learn why he was killed, and by whom. My fee is $1,000 against expenses." "Accepted," she said at once. She took out a checkbook, wrote the amount without a blink, and handed me the check. A woman who can write $1,000 check in a murder interview is either rich, desperate, or practical. I put her down as 2 out of 3. When she had gone, Wolfe grunted. A cabinet of trifles. God save us. Not interested. On the contrary, appalled. Go. Riddle Street was one of those narrow Manhattan streets that seemed to have been designed by men who distrusted both air and honesty. Martin Vale's house was a slim brick structure with curtains half drawn and a brass knocker polished more carefully than the step. There was a patrolman at the door. I showed him my card. He read it, shrugged, and let me in. The hall was close and faintly smelled of old dust and burned paper. Sergeant Rowcliffe emerged from the back room, spare and sandy and hostile on principle. He knew me, and the knowledge did him no good. "Well," he said, "if it ain't the Orchid Bureau." "That hurts," I told him. "I came to help your vocabulary." "What do you want?" "A look." Number I moved anyway. His no had never been a physical barrier. The room at the back was the kind of room a man chooses when he wants the world to lower its voice. Heavy curtains, dark furniture, thick rug, shelves built into the walls. A tall walnut cabinet stood against one side, with shallow drawers and pigeonholes. On the shelves and table and in the open drawers were objects so ordinary and so intimate that together they made a nastier collection than jewels. A cheap wedding ring in a velvet box, 3 keys on a ring with a hotel tag, a pawn ticket, a sealed envelope marked "Only Forgive," a child's report card folded into quarters, a silver cigarette case with a dent, a theater program, a dried flower pressed in paper. Dozens more. Vale's body had been removed, but the chalk outline remained on the rug beside the cabinet. There was a dark stain near the head. One drawer of the cabinet stood open 6 inches. On the table by the window sat a metal ash bowl full of grey powder and curled black scraps. "Cause of death?" I asked. "Blunt force," Rowcliffe said. "Hit at the temple with something hard." "Found the weapon?" "Number time. Medical examiner says between 4:30 and 5:15. Any forced entry?" "Numberer." "Robbery," he snorted. "Wallet on him, watch on him, silver in the room." If it was robbery, the thief had a code. I moved closer to the ash bowl. A few scraps had not wholly surrendered. One fragment showed part of a typed line, "Not return." Another had the corner of a letterhead, only a V still visible. "Were these papers still warm when found?" I asked. "Yes." "That's useful." "To who?" to anyone who thinks who found him. The cousin, Julia Riddle. What's your line on her? He gave me a blank look. What's yours? I asked first. She had a reason to be there, which is a start. She says he called her at noon and told her to come at 5. Says she found him dead. You believe her? I don't get paid to believe people. That was one of his better efforts. I let him keep it. What about that open drawer? I asked. We haven't finished inventory. Anything obviously missing? How would I know? You got a catalogue. It held 6 tied packets, a small black notebook, and an empty rectangular space, neat enough to suggest that something had been removed. Not a large object, a case perhaps, a box, an envelope stiffened by contents. Who last saw him alive? I asked. Cleaning woman left at 3:30, says he was alone. A man named Otto Krell came at 4. Krell who? Jeweler, says Vale was holding an item for him. What item? Wouldn't say clearly. Something for a customer. When did he leave? Before 4:30. Anybody after him? Maybe a man in a dark overcoat around 5. Neighbor across the street saw him go in, didn't see him come out. Could it have been Julia Riddle? Neighbor says no, different build. That made me turn it over again. Any list of Vale's clients? Maybe, in that notebook, Rowcliffe said, jerking his chin at it. Dates, initials, amounts, could be deposits, could be payments, could be choir practice. Get out, Goodwin. I took a last look around the room, no photographs, no flowers, no nonsense. A room arranged by a man who collected pieces of private defeat and had taught himself to find them orderly. That sort of order is never as neat as it looks. On my way out, I climbed to the 2nd floor without permission and got away with it for 12 seconds, which is enough to be useful. The bedroom was tidy, too tidy. A made bed, a dresser, a wardrobe, a shaving set aligned like enlisted men. On the dresser stood one framed photograph, turned face down. I turned it over. A woman around 25, dark hair, serious eyes. No inscription. Rowcliffe reached the landing while I was putting it back. I set out. You do repeat yourself, I told him. Across the street a tobacconist supplied me with a cigar I didn't want and a witness statement I wanted even less. Yes, he had seen a man in a tan hat go into Vale's house around 4 and come out fast. Yes, he had seen an older man in a dark overcoat go in near 5. No, he had not seen his face clearly. No, he had not seen him come out because a delivery truck blocked the view. His description of him was middle height, older, which was one of those contributions the public makes to detection in a spirit of equality. Next door to Vale's, a nervous woman admitted hearing a thump a little, before 5, and seeing an older man in a dark overcoat enter. Not Otto Krell, she thought. This one moved differently. How differently? I asked. As if he had made up his mind, she said, and closed the door, as if decision were indecent. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was in the office awaiting beer and information. I gave him both as available. He listened without interruption, which meant the matter had begun to interest him. When I finished, he said, the photograph upstairs, a woman. So I gathered. Who was she? No inscription. You did not bring it. Rowcliffe was climbing. Archie, one would suppose you respected the law. In spots. He ignored that. The important point is not the oddity of the objects, but their relation. If any, Krell was told that a new discovery altered the value of several items. Several, Archie. Not one. Therefore Martin Vale had learned something that connected what had previously seemed separate. Or made them separable at a profit. Yes. Wolfe shut his eyes. A man who stores shame for others develops a taxonomy. Somewhere in that cabinet there is a principle. Before I could admire that, the bell rang again. I went to the hall, opened the door, and admitted a compact man with a neat black mustache and the tense polish of a jeweler who knew the difference between value and price. He introduced himself as Otto Krell. In the office, he sat only after Wolfe had told him to stop perching. I have heard, Krell said. That you are looking into Martin Vale's death? Wolfe nodded. Briefly, why are you here? Because my connection with Mr. Vale may be misunderstood by the police. The police misunderstand everything. Why should that trouble you especially? Krell's mouth hardened. Because one item in his keeping concerns a respectable family. Your respectable families, I said, are always getting themselves misplaced in jewelry. He ignored me. I own a shop on 8th Avenue. Occasionally clients require discretion. What item? Wolfe asked. A brooch. For whom? I cannot say. Wolfe made a small motion with one hand. Then leave, Krell blinked. Please. It is an old diamond brooch with a sapphire center. It belonged once to a woman now dead. Its ownership became complicated. Mr. Vale was holding it until the matter could be privately settled. And now it may be missing. I don't know. You visited Vale yesterday to inquire. Yes, at 4, approximately. What did he say? That the situation had changed. How? He said he had discovered something that altered the value of several items in his possession. There it was again. Wolfe opened his eyes fully. Several items, he repeated. Did he explain further? Number he heard the bell ring and told me I must leave at once. What time? About 4:15. And you saw no one arriving. Number did he seem frightened? Yes. Of what? I don't know. Wolfe regarded him. You know more than you say. Krell didn't answer that because any answer would have been a confession. Why come to me? Wolfe asked. Because I prefer discretion. Discretion is expensive. Krell took out his wallet and laid 5 $100 bills on my desk cash. That made the air in the room a little sharper. Honest men do pay in cash, but worried men do it more often. Wolfe glanced at the money as if cash were a vulgar dialect. Very well. To the extent that your interest coincides with the truth, I accept you as a client. If you lie to me or withhold something essential, I will drop you into Inspector Kramer's lap and let him bruise both of you. Krell nodded stiffly and gave me his address. After he had gone, Wolfe sat silent for half a minute. Then he said, Objects, Archie. Everyone is hypnotized by objects. A brooch, a wedding ring, a child's report card, a pawn ticket. But the objects may not matter in themselves. Their owners matter, or the relation among their owners. You think Vale learned that 2 or more of his clients belonged to the same story. I think he learned something that converted souvenirs into evidence. That was worth having. I took out my notebook. Tomorrow, Wolfe said. You will see Miss Riddle again, also Krell's shop, also the cleaning woman, also, if possible, the half-brother in Connecticut. I want Martin Vale's history before he became custodian of private misery. Anything else? Yes. Get the police inventory. Rocliffe will resist. Improve him. After dinner, while Wolfe read and Fritz, no doubt, meditated tomorrow's lunch. I sat in my room and went over the pieces. Martin Vale, keeper of other people's embarrassments, frightened for the first time. Julia Riddle summoned at noon and arriving too late. Otto Krell, paying cash to preserve a respectable family from an indiscreet sapphire. A woman in a grey coat entering near 5 and vanishing neatly. Burned papers still warm. An open drawer with something missing. A face-down photograph upstairs. And one new discovery that had altered the value of several old deposits. Wolfe had been right before he saw the room. The truth would not be grand. Not international conspiracies, not diamonds in bulk, not a blackmail empire fit for headlines. Smaller than that, sadder than that. The kind of truth people fold into envelopes and hide in drawers because they cannot bear its size. And sometimes a truth small enough to fit in a drawer is sharp enough to kill. Chapter 2. The Trophy Keeper. By Wednesday morning, I had learned 2 things. First, Martin Vale had managed to make himself detested with a refinement almost worth admiring. Second, Nero Wolfe had taken the cabinet personally. That was unusual. Wolfe does not often resent a dead man unless the dead man has been untidy in thought. Martin had not been untidy. He had been worse. He had been methodical in a mean way. The kind of man who gives order a bad name, By breakfast Wolfe had already referred to him as that curator of furtive squalor, that archivist of petty collapses, and once, with special disgust, the trophy keeper. It fitted. Martin had made a hobby of collecting confessions people never meant to give. Not blackmail, not exactly. He had not, as far as anyone yet proved, telephoned husbands at midnight, or mailed unsigned notes, or demanded cash in exchange for silence. His method was at once smaller and dirtier. He listened too well, remembered too much, and filed each weakness away like a collector, pinning insects under glass. A foolish letter, a trinket from the wrong pocket, a hotel key, a receipt, a school report intercepted before a father saw it, a wedding ring taken off, and then miserably reclaimed. Each object meant almost nothing to the world, and everything to one frightened owner. The street had tolerated him as people tolerate a mirror in harsh light, resentfully, helplessly, and with a temptation to smash it. Wolfe began with the cabinet itself. He did not go to Riddle Street. That would have required locomotion before necessity had become indecent. Instead, he installed himself behind his desk, placed a legal pad before him, and instructed me to procure the police inventory by means not requiring a gunshot. Since Sergeant Rowcliffe and I were not made for cooperation, that took an hour, a little bluff, a little pressure through Inspector Kramer's office, and one favor owed by a clerk who admired my neckties. By 11:30, I was back with a typed preliminary inventory of the contents of Martin Vale's cabinet and room. Wolfe held out his hand. I gave it to him. He read in silence, his lips pushing out once or twice when a particular item offended his sense of proportion. Then he dropped the pages on the desk. Apfui. Look at this, Archie. Envelope containing lock of hair. Receipt from a pawnbroker dated 8 years ago. Child's arithmetic report. Theater program signed on the back, only forgive me. A hotel key with no hotel name. 3 ladies' rings, none of value. A man's cuff link, 5 sealed packets marked only with initials. A photograph cut in half. He closed his eyes. The man was not a blackmailer. He was a fetishist. That's a strong word before lunch. It is exact. He took emotional debris and made a museum of it. I sat down at my desk, the question being whether one of his exhibits came alive and hit him. Number the question being whether the cabinet is arranged by sentiment, chronology, or leverage. He tapped the inventory. These labels, personal, hold, receipts, Michigan, Selenius, idiotic. Yet there must be a secondary order. Vale would not have trusted memory alone. Find the notebook entry numbers. I had copied them separately. The black notebook from the unlabeled drawer contained dates, initials, and figures, usually small amounts. Sometimes none at all. I handed him that sheet too. He studied it. Repeated initials. Jaya, no, not Miss Riddle. Dates inconsistent. Okay, that could be Krell, though he is a tradesman and perhaps merely a courier. LB several times over 4 years, ET 5 times. Then this, 3 entries grouped within a week, all marked with a cross. Did the police mention a meaning for the cross? Number because they are blind. Crosses mean termination, transfer, or death. We must discover which. The bell rang. I got up, but Fritz had appeared in the hall ahead of me and opened the door with the expression he reserves for guests who may interfere with sources. A woman came in, and I knew her at once from the face. Down photograph upstairs. Dark hair, though with more silver in it than the photograph had shown, and the same serious eyes. She was handsome in the way weathered stone is handsome, less from smoothness than from endurance. Her coat was plain, her gloves inexpensive, and she carried herself as if entering other people's houses was a duty, not a privilege. She gave her name as Miss Ellen Tormer. Wolfe, when I brought her in, looked at her 1 second longer than courtesy required. He had recognized the name from the notebook before she sat down. Yes, Miss Tormer. I have come because the police were at my apartment this morning, she said. They asked whether I knew Martin Vale. I said yes. They asked whether he ever kept anything for me. I said that was my affair. Then they became clumsy. Someone suggested I might do better with a private detective than with them. Who suggested it? Wolfe asked. a policeman with tired eyes who had apparently read newspapers. She glanced at me. I believe he meant Mr. Goodwin. That was charitable of him, I said. She ignored me. Mr. Wolfe, I knew Martin many years ago, before he became what he became. If my name is among his papers, I prefer to know why. Wolfe nodded. Sensibly put. Did he keep anything for you? Yes. What? A photograph, the one in his bedroom? A faint change crossed her face. Not surprise, but annoyance at herself for not having foreseen the question. Yes. Why should he keep a photograph of you for 20 years? Because once he intended to marry me. I glanced at Wolfe. He did not glance back, and did not. Number he chose usefulness over decency, and I chose not to assist. When did you last see him alive? 3 weeks ago. Did he communicate with you yesterday? Number, did he ever threaten you? Number, Martin preferred implication. Threats are crude. That was exactly put. Wolfe leaned back. Then why are you uneasy? She hesitated. Because once long ago Martin learned something about my family and never forgot it. I had hoped he had lost interest. If he has been sorting old papers, he was burning some when killed, I said. Her hands tightened once in her lap. Then perhaps he had remembered too much. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Miss Tormer, you will not help yourself by speaking in contours. What did Martin know? She looked from him to me and back. My younger brother took money from his employer. Not a great sum. Our father repaid it quietly. No charge was made. Martin somehow learned of it. He kept the receipt of repayment. The original receipt. Yes. Why on earth would your father permit that? He did not. Martin took it from my brother when he was drunk and ashamed and boasting that the matter was buried. Ah, Wolfe said softly. A trophy. She gave a bitter little nod. Yes. I made a note. A receipt of repayment. A brother who stole. A family secret embalmed in a drawer. Did Martin ever use it against you? Wolfe asked. Not directly. But when he wished a favor, he had only to mention my brother's name. What favors? Introductions, information. Once a recommendation for employment for a man who didn't deserve it. She lifted her chin. Nothing criminal. Only degrading. That sounded like Martin exactly. Not enough villainy for headlines. More than enough for a murder. Wolfe dismissed her with instructions to remain available. When she had gone, he drummed his fingers once on the desk. You see, Archie, I see one man could make enemies without charging interest. More, he converted weakness into a collection and influence into recreation. He may not have blackmailed for money, but he trafficked in moral debt. That should look handsome on a tombstone. His tombstone should be blank. I grinned. You're warming. Number I am classifying. He pushed the inventory toward me. Miss Tormer corresponds to Et in the notebook. The repeated entries mean repeated leverage, not storage. Therefore, the figures may represent favors, not fees. We have been asking the wrong question. Which was, what did Vale keep? The better one is, what did he get in return for keeping it? That opened the room on Riddle Street in a new direction. The cabinet no longer looked like a junk shop of private shame. It looked like an account book kept in objects instead of numbers. And if Martin Vale had discovered something that altered the value of several items at once, then perhaps he had not found a richer secret. Perhaps he had found that several of his trophies belonged to the same old story. Wolfe shut his eyes. Find Julia Riddle. Again. Yes. The cousin knows more family history than she offered. Also see Krell and Archie. Yeah? Ask yourself. Why a man such as Martin Vale would burn papers only when frightened. If he lived by possession, destruction must have cost him. That was good enough to carry with me to the door. On my way out, I looked once at the inventory sheet lying open on Wolfe's desk. Hotel key, report card, wedding ring, pawnbroker's receipt, half photograph, repayment receipt, sapphire brooch, quiet things. All right. Quiet the way a loaded revolver is quiet. Chapter 3. The harmless inventory. By Thursday afternoon, the cabinet on Riddle Street had begun to look less like evidence and more like satire. I had managed, through means too honourable to describe to Sergeant Rowcliffe and too dishonourable to describe to Wolfe in detail, to get a closer copy of the complete inventory. It was typed on cheap police paper in a language intended to make the absurd respectable item. Packet, envelope, ring, receipt. But stripped of that uniform, the collection was nearly comic in its meekness. Inside the cabinet were 37 envelopes, each marked in Martin Vale's neat hand. He had used a small, precise script, the kind produced by men who believe control can be made visible. Some bore only initials, some were dated, some had brief descriptions written with a delicacy that made them nastier. Mrs. Bell pawned her mother's brooch. Theo Gray forged his age for the docks. Nina Cross stole flowers from graves and replanted them in her yard. Jail dismissed maid without wages. Rush borrowed war medal, never returned. Mrs. Dar took communion while husband living elsewhere. And so on, petty, private, survivable, enough to embarrass. Not enough at first glance to kill. That was what struck me hardest, sitting in the office with the list spread over my desk, while Wolfe regarded it from across the room, with the expression of a judge obliged to hear a case involving stolen pigeons. Martin had not assembled a cabinet of grand sins, no embezzlements worth headlines, no mistresses in diamonds, no forged wills, no poisoned cousins, no vanished trusts. His trophies were all small collapses of character, tiny disgraces people would hate to have aired, and would hate even more to admit they feared. A woman pawning a family brooch and redeeming it in secret. A man shaving 2 years off his birth to get work on the docks. A widow pocketing cemetery flowers and transplanting them into her own yard like stolen mourning. Each one by itself was the kind of thing that might sour a dinner table, strain a marriage, tighten a mouth in church. Not the kind of thing that should crack a skull. Yet one slot in the cabinet stood empty. The police inventory noted it only by omission, which is a policeman's way of staring without seeing. But when I had been in the room, I had marked it. An unlabeled drawer, 6 packets, a black notebook, and 1 dust-framed vacancy. Recent enough that the wood around it still showed the outline. Something rectangular had been there for a long time, and had been removed not much before Martin died. Its absence had more force than the presence of all the rest. Wolfe agreed, which was lucky, since agreement from him is rarer than orchids. In January, he sat behind his desk with the inventory on his knees, his lips protruded in distaste. "Archie," he said, "the obvious temptation is to seek among these items something grave enough to provoke murder. That is childish, none of them qualifies. You mean Nina Cross and her cemetery gardening don't suggest a homicidal temperament. I mean that if a man were killed for that collection, New York would have 1 corpse on every block." He tapped the list. "These are not deadly secrets, they are social abrasions." "Then why keep them?" "Because Martin Vale was a jackdaw with a filing system." That was good even for Wolfe. I let it rest. He lifted 1 sheet. "Observe the labels. Each item is phrased, not as a title but as a sentence. Not brooch. But Mrs. Bell pawned her mother's brooch. Not forged age, but Theo Gray forged his age for the docks. The object mattered less to Vale than the attached confession. So he wasn't storing souvenirs, he was bottling admissions. Yes. And that makes the missing item more important, not less. Whatever occupied that slot was significant enough, either to Martin or his killer, to be removed under pressure. I nodded. The ash bowl. Precisely, Martin burned papers. Someone removed 1 object. Those acts may be connected or distinct, but they were deliberate. He closed his eyes, which meant thought had begun and interruption would be fatal only to me. After half a minute he said, "What did Miss Tormer tell you of the receipt concerning her brother?" "That Martin got hold of the repayment receipt and used it to squeeze favors." "Not money?" "Number." "Then he preferred dependence to profit." "Money is crude, dependence endures." I had already learned that much from 3 interviews that morning. The cleaning woman, Mrs. Heller, had supplied little, except the useful fact that Martin often took out certain envelopes and read them as another man might read old letters. Not daily, not often, but when he had callers whose names matched the cabinet labels, he would sometimes go into the room alone afterward and stand by the drawers a few minutes, smiling to himself, like a person remembering a joke nobody else knew. That from Mrs. Heller, who disliked him with a vigor that improved her memory. Then I had seen Mrs. Bell, who turned out to be a plump woman on the West Side with honest eyes and a talent for flushed silence. Yes, years ago she had pawned her dead mother's brooch to cover rent money for her son after he lost work. Yes, Martin had somehow come to know it. No, he had never asked for money, but twice in the last 5 years he had appeared at her door wanting introductions, information, or a name passed along. Nothing scandalous, nothing criminal, only the sort of thing a woman does while hating herself for the doing. He made me feel as if he had watched me crying, she said. That was Martin exactly. He had lied about his age to get dock work during the war years. Martin knew it because Theo, drunk and grateful after a card game, had once told him so. Thereafter Martin had treated the fact like a visiting card, not a weapon, worse, a reminder. He never threatened. Theo told me. He'd just say, a man ought to be grateful his beginnings aren't discussed too widely. Then he'd want some little thing. That phrase stayed with me. Some little thing. Martin had been living on little things all around. By the time I got back to the brownstone with these additions, Wolfe had arranged the envelopes on paper into categories of his own making. Shame, fear, sentiment, theft, deceit, he said. You forgot bad taste. That includes most of them. Notice this, nearly all are survivable, because they concern an act already over. Pawned, forged, stole, borrowed, concealed, past tense. Martin specialized in completed weakness, not ongoing crime. Safer, for him. Yes, past acts do not panic as quickly. I looked at the list again. He was right. Everything in the cabinet belonged to something done and buried, not something still active. That meant the missing item, if it mattered enough to prompt murder, probably differed in kind. Either it pointed to something present, not past, or it linked several old embarrassments into a current danger. Then the bell rang and Saul Panzer came in, neat as ever, bringing with him the smell of outside air and competence. Wolfe had sent him 2 hours earlier to nose around Riddle Street in ways that don't involve official paper. Saul sat down, crossed one leg, and handed me a memorandum. What have you got? I asked. A neighbor 2 houses down remembered Martin had a visitor Monday night, Saul said. Man, dark overcoat, about 60, looked like the clock repairman across the street. Came out angry. Face. No good. Hat down. But here's better. Otto Krell visited Vale more often than he admitted, 3 times in the last month at least. That made Wolfe open his eyes. Indeed. Saul nodded. Also, Martin went Tuesday morning to a stationery store on 9th Avenue and bought a packet of large envelopes and a bottle of mucilage. The clerk remembered because Martin asked for the strongest glue they had. Why? I said. Saul spread his hands. He didn't tell the clerk. Wolfe's lips pushed out. Number, but a man who buys envelopes and glue on the day he dies intends to package or repackage something. Maybe the missing item, I said. Maybe, Wolfe said, or copies. That improved the room all at once. I felt it happen. The harmless inventory was no longer harmless. It had merely been arranged to appear so. Vale had lived by storing petty moral debts. But on the morning of his death he had bought fresh envelopes and glue. He had been preparing something. Reclassifying, perhaps, or sending, Saul added. And one more thing. The tobacconist across from Vale's says the woman in the grey coat, who went in around 5, had been there once before, a week earlier. Same coat, same quick walk, known to Martin then, I said. Likely, Wolfe grunted. Number known to the house perhaps, not necessarily to Martin. Archie, the essential question is not what was taken. That will come. The first question is, Who knew something was there? I stared at him. Meaning that an empty slot matters only to someone aware it had once been full. A thief who did not know the object existed would not select it. A killer in panic would snatch at random. But this was chosen. Therefore, at least one person besides Martin knew that a specific item or packet was in that drawer. That narrows it to everybody he ever squeezed. Number it narrows it to those who had seen the cabinet opened, or had deposited the item, or had been told of it by Martin, which is narrower and more promising. He leaned back, satisfied enough to be annoying. Martin Vale's collection is largely harmless in substance and deadly only in arrangement. That is why we must not admire its contents. We must admire its audience. Saul left. I made notes. Wolfe shut his eyes again, but I could tell by the set of his mouth that the case had tightened for him. 37 envelopes, 37 tiny private disgraces, and one missing object whose absence was louder than all of them. It was the first thing in Martin Vale's cabinet that did not look harmless, and maybe the only thing that never had been. Chapter 4. The widow next door, the nearest witness to murder, is seldom the one with the clearest conscience. By Friday morning, that role belonged to Ada Mercer, Martin Vale's neighbor on the east side, widow 60 if a day, and the sort of woman who had spent 20 years hearing more through walls than she had ever heard through conversation. I went to see her at 10:30, which was a mistake, only because it gave her enough daylight to examine me thoroughly. She let me into a narrow parlor that smelled of furniture polish, old curtains, and a life conducted on schedule. There were framed photographs on the mantel, antimacassars on chairs, and one glass-fronted cabinet full of porcelain dogs whose expressions all suggested private moral superiority. Mrs. Mercer herself matched the room. Small, controlled, dressed in black that was no longer mourning but habit. Her face had the dried look of a woman who had once cried conscientiously and then quit because it seemed immodest. She offered me a chair as if lending it temporarily. "You are not from the police," she said at once. "Number, that may be an advantage. The police ask broad questions and listen with their boots. That's poetry. It is irritation. I can work with that. You live next to Martin Vale." "I live next to him," she corrected. "It is already quieter." There was no point pretending shock. "You didn't like him." No one liked Martin. Some tolerated him, some feared him, many resented him. That is not the same thing. "No," I said. "It's more crowded." She almost smiled, then remembered herself. "What do you want?" "What you heard on Tuesday." She folded her hands. "I have told the police." "I know, you told them you heard a thump, perhaps a voice." "I did. And that was half of it." Her eyes sharpened. "Young man, do not try cleverness on me." "I wouldn't dare." "But you heard more. The walls between these houses are thin. Yours is the closest room to Martin's back office. If he sneezed, you probably knew whether it was sincere." That held her. Not because she liked me, but because she disliked being underestimated more. At length, she said, "I heard voices." "How many?" "Two. At first the other voice. Then Martin, man and woman." "Yes." "Time?" "A little before 5. "Tell me exactly." She adjusted the cuff of one glove she wasn't wearing. A sign, I had learned, that she was arranging memory for presentation. "The first voice was low," she said. "A man's voice pleading. Anyway, then Martin answered, sharper, hurt. Not angry at first, then angry." "What did he say?" Her mouth tightened. "He said, 'You should have told him yourself.'" I sat still. "You're sure?" "Yes. Not them. Not her. Number him." That was something. Not much yet, but something with a pulse. What happened then? They spoke over one another for a moment. I could not distinguish words. Then something broke. Glass, I think. A small thing, not a window. Then silence. A minute later I heard the front door close. Softly. She looked at me with dry approval. "Yes, very softly." The way people leave when they are trying not to make an event of themselves. The way frightened people leave, she said. Guilt is noisier. That was better than what I had offered, and I let her keep the point. Did you look out? Number. Why not? Because I am not foolish. That was only partly true. The other part was that she had looked often enough in life and learned the cost. You recognized any voice? Martin's, of course. The others? She hesitated. Number. You're lying. Her head came up. How dare? Because if you didn't recognize them, you'd have said so at once. Instead, you weighed it. You know one of them or think you do. She was silent long enough to become eloquent. At last she said, the low voice may have been a man I have heard before. Who? I don't know his name. Dark overcoat, hat low. He came to Martin's house 2 or 3 times in recent weeks. Age? Not young. Younger than I am. That narrows it beautifully. It helps. Did Martin ever argue with her before? Not loudly. But there was strain. Any relation to Julia Riddle? I have seen Miss Riddle. It was not she. That matched what she had implied earlier. What about a man's voice? Low distressed, I could not place it. Could it have been Otto Krell? I have no idea who that is. Did Martin often have visitors at that hour? Yes, men, women, both. Mostly people leaving with the look of having remembered something unpleasant. That was Martin's social circle, all right. I pressed once more. Mrs. Mercer, why didn't you tell the police the exact sentence? Her answer came too quickly to be invented. Because policemen hear language as accusation. I heard disappointment. That one I took home intact. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was in the office with beer and a plate of crackers, which meant he had reached the stage of thought where nourishment had to be admitted, but not welcomed. I gave him Ada Mercer's statement, word for word. He stopped me only once, to have the sentence repeated. You should have told him yourself, he murmured. Yes. Wolfe shut his eyes. Excellent. Funny way to describe a cracked skull. Do not be tedious. The sentence matters. It is not the language of extortion. No, I said. A blackmailer says pay me or I'll tell. This sounds more like wounded ethics. Or wounded vanity. Or old grievance. But not a commercial exchange. He opened his eyes. Martin was confronting someone about disclosure, not threatening exposure as such, but reproaching concealment. That fits Ada's other word, hurt. Yes. He reached for the pad and wrote the sentence down in his large, deliberate hand, then underlined it once. Wolfe never underlined anything trivial. If Martin said, you should have told him yourself, then at least 3 people are implied. Speaker, listener, and the absent him. One person had concealed something from another, and Martin knew of it. That makes the missing item less a discovery than a showdown. Precisely. I leaned back. Ada also heard glass break. Could be the photograph frame upstairs, or a drinking glass, or something from the cabinet. Number the photograph frame was intact when you saw it. True. Then a small object. Perhaps dropped, perhaps struck from a hand. He frowned. The front door closed softly afterward. That also matters. Because people who leave quietly after violence are not always killers. They may believe the violence has not yet become irrevocable, or they may still hope to preserve dignity. That is a refined way to describe panic. It is exact. I told him Ada thought the sharper voice belonged to the same woman seen visiting Martin in recent weeks, possibly the grey coat woman from Tuesday. Wolfe nodded, but did not brighten. Description without identity rarely charms him. She also said the tone was hurt before it became angry, I added. Good. Then the confrontation was personal before it was dangerous. He settled deeper in the chair, fingertips together. Archie, the central error has been to imagine Martin Vale as merely a repository of shame. He was more active than that. He curated his trophies, yes, but he also inserted himself into the stories they came from. He advised, reproached, insinuated. He made himself indispensable in dramas that were not his, which is one way to get killed by people with stronger feelings than yours. Yes, I watched him think. The room was quiet, except for traffic on 35th Street, and a faint clatter from the kitchen where Fritz was improving civilization. At length, Wolfe said, the missing secret had not merely been discovered, it had been confronted. That's Ada's sentence talking. It is. Martin was not opening an old envelope to admire the past. He was using it in an argument about what someone should have confessed to someone else. Therefore, the missing item probably connected two people still living and one person still ignorant. That gives us a triangle. Number it gives us a room. That was Wolfe. Hand him a triangle and he wants architecture. I got out my notebook. So where next? Find out who among Martin's visitors was involved in an old concealment from a man. A husband, father, brother, employer, lover, any male sufficiently placed to hear you should have told him yourself and matter. He glanced at the cabinet inventory. Also, identify any item whose power depends not on scandal, but on withheld kinship, ownership, or paternity. You said that calmly. I am calm. You don't sound it. I am interested. That was more than calm. For Wolfe, it was practically dancing. Before I left again, he tapped the note with Ada Mercer's sentence on it. Archie, do not ask first what was taken. Ask who knew it had been there. I heard you the first time, and now you begin to understand it. A missing object is selected knowledge. Someone came not to search, but to recover, or destroy, something already known. Confronted, I said. Yes, I went out with that. By then the case had changed shape in my head. The cabinet no longer seemed a dead man's hoard of mean little keepsakes. It had become a stage property room for dramas Martin had no business directing. A receipt here, a brooch there, an old photograph, a pawn ticket, a ring, each one harmless by itself. Together, maybe not. And somewhere in that unlabeled drawer, there had been one item that stopped being a trophy and became a demand. Martin had not stumbled over it. He had put it in someone's face. Chapter 5. The Circle of the Ashes by Saturday. Wolfe had done something he ordinarily avoids. Unless driven by principle, appetite, or insult, he invited a roomful of strangers into the brownstone before dinner. He did not call it a gathering. He called it economy. If 6 people each possess 1/6 of a fact, he told me, it is sometimes useful to put them where they may annoy one another into candor. That sounds festive. It sounds efficient. The 6 were not, in fact, all equal fractions. Mrs. Bell came because she had once pawned her mother's brooch and had never forgiven Martin Vale for knowing it. Theo Gray came because he had lied about his age for dock work 20 years earlier and still reacted to Martin's memory of it, as a horse reacts to a whip long after the strap is gone. Nina Cross came because, having stolen flowers from graves and replanted them in her yard, she regarded the entire business with a kind of bitter comedy. Ellen Tormer came because the old receipt concerning her brother had ceased to look isolated. Julia Riddle came because she was family and disliked absences in information more than she disliked discomfort. Otto Krell came because a respectable family's sapphire brooch had drifted too near the center of things for him to stay away. Wolfe sat behind his desk, monumental and dissatisfied, while I placed the chairs and counted resentments. Fritz, with magnificent tact, confined himself to beer, coffee, and contempt. The meeting began badly and improved. Mrs. Bell cried almost at once, not loudly and not from nerves. She cried because Wolfe, in his appalling direct way, asked whether Martin Vale had ever used the brooch story to influence her conduct. And the word conduct did what kindness would not have done. She dabbed at her eyes and admitted yes twice, perhaps 3 times. Martin had pressed her for introductions, and once for a letter of recommendation for a woman he said was in difficulty. She had complied because the memory of that pawnshop ticket still made her feel 19 and shabby. Theo Gray did not cry. He cursed. "Nosy little devil," he said of Martin. Never wanted money. That would have been cleaner. He wanted a man to know he remembered. That disturbed you? Wolfe asked. It would disturb a saint. You are not a saint. No one has accused you. Not yet, Theo muttered. Nina Cross laughed when her turn came. She was a lean woman, with cheeks like folded paper and eyes full of old mockery. "Flowers," she said. "Imagine preserving that." "My husband was dying. I wanted color in the yard and had no money for it. So I took flowers from graves after dusk and replanted them. Martin found out because he had a soul made of keyholes." "Did he exploit the knowledge?" Wolfe asked. "Exploit? Number, he enjoyed it. Every spring he would ask whether the dead were blooming nicely. That produced no smiles, which was right. One by one they gave Martin the same obituary under different wording. He had listened too well, kept too much, and preferred leverage to cash. He had not ruined them. He had merely remained present in their shame. That was enough to make them all wince when his name came up, but not enough to make any of them care about the cabinet itself. That interested Wolfe more than their grievances. He asked each of them, in turn, whether they had ever seen the interior of the cabinet, known its arrangement, or had any idea where Martin kept their particular envelope. The answers varied in tone but not substance. Number Mrs. Bell had never gone beyond the chair in the back room. Theo had seen Martin take out an envelope once, but not from which drawer. Nina said she would rather have swallowed pins than watch him open that cabinet. Even Ellen Tormer, who had known Martin in earlier years, had never seen more than his hand on a drawer front. And none of them, under Wolfe's steady eye, showed the slightest proprietary concern over the missing slot. That was important. When the last protest and bitterness had run down to a useful silence, Wolfe folded his hands over the slope of his yellow waistcoat and spoke as if he were remarking on mushrooms. "So you all dislike Martin Vale. Several of you had reason to resent him. Yet none of you cared enough about his collection to remove a single file from it." No one answered, because there was nothing to answer with except truth. After they had gone, leaving the office stale with perfume, wet wool, and resentment, I shut the door and came back to my desk. That was cheerful. It was clarifying. "You believe them, broadly. They are all injured vanity and old discomfort, not murder. More to the point, their relation to the cabinet is passive. Martin valued the contents. They valued only being free of him. Then the missing item belonged to somebody else, or meant something wholly different." He reached for the envelope on his desk. It contained what I had picked up that afternoon from Riddle Street after another skirmish with Rowcliffe. Not the official ashes from the bowl. He still guarded those with the primitive tenderness of a policeman toward anything bagged and labeled. This came from the grate in the small upstairs sitting room, which the police had glanced at and dismissed because it held only cold ash and one or two charred scraps. I had been less dismissive. "Show it again," Wolfe said. I tipped the contents carefully onto a sheet of white paper laid across the blotter. Most of it was ordinary grey residue, curled black edges, and the crumbled remains of paper that had no desire to survive. But among it lay one fragment larger than the others, burned in a rough circle as though a sheet had caught fire from the center and died outward. One corner, by accident or reluctance, had escaped complete destruction. On that spared corner 3 words remained legible. "Not his daughter." I had seen Wolfe interested before, but seldom like that. He did not move much. He merely became denser somehow, as if all his weight had shifted into thought. "There," he said softly. "Yeah. That was not in the ash bowl downstairs. Number in the grate upstairs. Then Martin burned papers in 2 places." "Looks like it." Wolfe nodded. "And this one was not a receipt, nor a pawn ticket, nor some sentimental trifle. It was part of a sentence, likely from a letter or copied statement." I looked at the fragment again. Tiny words, ordinary words, and deadly in combination. "Not his daughter. It changes things," I said. "Entirely." He sat back and closed his eyes. That meant the room had better stay quiet, unless it wished to be excluded from civilization. I stayed quiet. At length he spoke. "Shame survives gossip. A woman may endure having it known she pawned a brooch. A man may endure an old lie about his age. Even theft of cemetery flowers can be borne if one has enough bitterness and wit. But blood and belonging." "Ah." His eyes opened. "Tell a man he is not a father, or a daughter she belongs to another blood, and you do not embarrass a life. You divide it. That fits Ada Mercer's sentence. Yes, you should have told him yourself. Exactly, not extortion, not commercial leverage, reproach over concealed parentage or kinship. I let that settle. The whole case did indeed change shape. Until then we had been moving among shabby moral keepsakes, the sort of things that stain but do not usually destroy. This was different, this cut under the skin to the frame. You think the missing file dealt with someone's parentage. I think it may have, or legitimacy, or adoption concealed, or false paternity, some fact of blood wrongly represented. He pointed at the fragment. And note the phrasing, not your daughter, but not his daughter. That suggests the sentence discussed a third person, someone telling someone else that a girl or woman was not the daughter of a particular man. Could be from a letter. Yes, could be about Julia Riddle, could be about anyone. Do not leap like an imbecile. I was stretching. Don't. He rose then, which for Wolfe was as significant as a magistrate banging a gavel. He crossed to the globe, stood with one hand resting on it, and scowled at South America for a while. Martin Vale, he said, spent years preserving petty confessions because they gave him influence without danger. Then at last he acquired something dangerous, or rediscovered it. Perhaps he connected it to one of the harmless envelopes, perhaps to several. That is why he told Krell the value of several items had changed. Because if one person isn't who everyone thinks, a brooch, a photo, a repayment receipt, lots of old junk might suddenly line up into family history. Wolfe turned his head. Good, sometimes you are almost tolerable. First, whether Martin Vale had any documented connection to births, adoptions, or family settlements. Second, who among our players could be ruined, not embarrassed, ruined by a revelation of false kinship and the missing file. We continue not to ask what it was, but who feared it. That was Wolfe at his most Wolfe, like ignoring the glitter for the structure beneath it. The cabinet on Riddle Street had looked like a mausoleum of tiny disgraces. Now it looked like camouflage, a brooch, a receipt, a photograph, a packet in a drawer, harmless inventory. And upstairs in a grate, reduced nearly to nothing, 3 surviving words that were enough to break open the whole design. Not his daughter. There are statements that make people blush, statements that make them lie, and statements that make them kill. This one belonged to the third class. Chapter 6. The man at the clock shop on Monday morning. Wolfe sent me across from Martin Vale's house to a place I should have visited sooner if I had been as clever as he paid me to pretend. Opposite the narrow brick front and its half-drawn curtains stood a shop with a painted sign so old the gold leaf had given up dignity and settled for memory. Elias Trent Clock Repair. It had been sitting there through the case from the beginning, visible from Vale's front windows and from the back of my mind, which is not always the same thing. Wolfe had reached it first. A man who spends his life among clocks, he had said over breakfast, cannot fail to know the hours of his street. Go see what time has told him. Clock shops always smell of patience gone dusty. Trent smelled of brass filings, old varnish, machine oil, and something faintly medicinal, as if broken time had to be sterilized before repair. Shelves ran up the walls, filled with clocks, waiting in pieces. Mantel clocks with their backs open, carriage clocks with their works exposed, wall clocks hanging like patients with bandaged faces. On a long bench under the front window lay springs, gears, screws, and tiny instruments spread in a neatness beyond honesty. It looked less like a business than a hospital for nervous metal. Elias Trent stood at the bench with an eyeglass clipped into one eye and a screwdriver, so small it might have been meant for beetles. He was around 60, spare, grey-haired, carefully dressed in a clean apron over a dark suit. The sort of man whose neckties are selected, not for charm but for reliability. He looked up when I entered, took in the face, the coat, the city on me, and removed the eyeglass. Yes, Archie Goodwin, I'm working with Nero Wolfe. That registered. The hand holding the screwdriver went still. Not much, but enough. What can I do for you? Talk if you have the parts. He set the tool down. The ticking in the room was steady and multitudinous, dozens of tiny insistences layered over one another, until time itself sounded fretful. About Martin Vale, his mouth flattened, not in grief, but in refusal. I did not know him well. That was the first lie, not because of how it sounded, because it came too fast before I had asked how well. Convenient, I said. You worked across the street from him for years. A man may work across from many people and know little of them. True, unless he watches his doorway while regulating watches. He didn't like that because it was near enough to true for discomfort. I had my own business. Still do, unless murder has slowed trade. Did you speak with him? Occasionally. Socially. Number. Then in what way? He hesitated a shade too long. As neighbors. Borrowing sugar. Number. That was a joke. You're a loud one. He didn't take it. Men like Elias Trent never accept jokes from strangers until they know where the edges are. A photograph of a young woman stood on a shelf near the back, beside a polished clock case. Not posed prettily, just seated, hands folded, looking straight into the camera with a calm that could become stubbornness if cornered. 23, perhaps. Dark hair, clear face. There was also another frame turned inward, which in that case was as good as waving. Your daughter? I asked, nodding at the photograph. Yes, Leah Trent. His gaze sharpened. You know her name. I know many names comes of low company. She was engaged to Owen Pike, the school teacher, was. Ended 2 weeks ago. Why? That is not your concern. Everything is my concern until someone proves otherwise. He looked toward the shop window, toward the house opposite, and back to me. It was a quick movement, but the street had entered the room. We are discussing Martin Vale, he said. Good, keep up. Did he know your daughter? Casually. Did he know about the engagement? I imagine the whole street knew. That's not the same thing. He said nothing. The clocks did. A regulator on the wall clicked with solemn indignation. I changed direction. Mr. Trent, you told me you didn't know Vale well, yet I haven't mentioned his cabinet, and you haven't mentioned it either. You've been careful. His face changed almost invisibly, the way a watch hand moves when you look away and then back. Cabinet. I smiled. That was poor. Silence. Then, too quickly, have you found all the envelopes? There it was. He knew it the instant it left his mouth. I knew it too, and somewhere on West 35th Street Wolfe would have grunted if he'd heard it. All the envelopes, I said lightly. Interesting question. His fingers closed on the edge of the bench. I meant the papers, the things he kept. Number, you meant envelopes, which means you knew how he filed them, I assumed. Don't it weakens you? The ticking in the room seemed to sharpen. Trent took off the apron slowly and folded it with excessive care, buying himself seconds. Men who repair clocks often believe delay can be made exact. At times, he said. Martin mentioned his ridiculous system. He was proud of it. Did he show you? Once. Once is enough. When? Months ago. Why? He came in here with a clock he claimed had belonged to his mother. It needed cleaning. While I examined it, he talked. Martin always talked when nervous. He said people trust paper too much, and that paper can outlive character. That sounds like him. Yes. What did he show you? Only that he kept sealed envelopes with notes on them. He seemed amused by it. Amused enough to get killed. He ignored that. Is this necessary? Very, did one of those envelopes concern you? Number, that was the second lie, and not as good as the first, because his eyes went to the inward, facing frame when he said it. I crossed and turned the frame around before he could stop me. It held a faded photograph of a younger Elias Trent beside a woman I took for his wife, and between them a child of perhaps 3, Leah, unless he kept strangers on the mantel for decoration. Put that down, he said sharply. I did. Sorry, but useful. For what? For showing me what sort of man you are, respectable, careful, protective, dangerous when pressed. That stopped him because it had gone under the ribs instead of over them. I took the final turn. Mr. Trent, Martin Vale was burning papers when he died. From one of them, only 3 words survived. He stared at me. I said them quietly. Not his daughter. His hands went to the workbench and gripped hard. Hard enough that little tins of screws rattled against one another with a dry metallic shiver. No man can counterfeit that kind of start unless he has rehearsed it. And Elias Trent hadn't all at once. The shop was full of ticking, not mere sound. Nerves. 100 tiny mechanical hearts beating accusation from shelves and wall hooks and half-open cases. In that chorus a silence opened between us, and in it I heard what Wolfe had expected me to hear. Panic. Not grief. Not surprise alone. Panic. Trent let go of the bench and said, too evenly, "I don't know what you mean." "No," I said, "but you know exactly what it could mean." He swallowed. That was small, but the clocks made small things loud. "It could refer to anyone," he said. "Sure. But it landed on you. Mr. Goodwin, if you came here to insult my family, I came here because Martin Vale didn't just collect petty embarrassments. He had something else. Something about blood and belonging. You knew he kept envelopes. You knew enough to ask whether all of them had been found. Your daughter's engagement broke 2 weeks before the murder. Martin was frightened the day he died. And when I say, not his daughter, you grip the bench like it's moving. His face had gone pale under the skin. Leave. Not yet. Did Martin tell you he had a paper about Leah? Number, did he imply it? Number, did he ever speak to you about Owen Pike? Number, that one might actually have been true. Panic doesn't always arrange itself efficiently. Did Leah know Martin? Only in passing. Did your late wife? His answer came after the smallest beat. She knew everyone on this street in passing, and more closely. Number, it was time to stop because another push then would only harden him, and I wanted the crack, not the wall. I took out a card and set it on the bench among the gears. Nero Wolfe will want to see you. I will not. You may prefer him to the police. They listen with their boots. That got the faintest flicker, which meant the line had life. At the door I turned back. One thing more. Did Martin and you speak on Tuesday? He looked at me with dry, stubborn misery, briefly. About. Nothing important. Mr. Trent, you have a room full of clocks and no idea what time it is. I left him with that and crossed the street to Martin Vale's shuttered house, where the curtains still held their sour secrecy. From the clockshop window opposite, Elias Trent could have watched every caller enter and leave, every bell ring, every coat color pass his glass. He had claimed distance. What he actually had was a front-row seat. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was in the office, reading a monograph on tropical orchids, with the expression of a man briefly consenting to scholarship. He laid it down when I entered and looked at my face. Well, he lied early and badly, knew about the envelopes without being told, asked if we had found all of them. Widower, careful. Daughter, Leah. Engagement to Owen Pike broken 2 weeks before the murder, and when I gave him the burned words, he nearly snapped his workbench. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Good. Not just surprise, panic. Yes. I gave him the rest. He listened without moving, which is how he moves best. When I finished, he closed his eyes. At last. That pleased you. It confirms direction. Elias Trent is the first person in this affair to react, not as a victim of Martin's pettiness, but as a custodian of something larger. Meaning Leah, meaning blood, parentage, inheritance, identity, something in that order. He opened his eyes again. And note this, Trent is a clockmaker. He sits opposite Martin's house. He observes habitually. He values order, continuity, proper sequence. Such men do not panic over gossip. They panic over disruptions in structure. That's handsome, but I still need the plain version. It is fracture. I nodded. The shop had told me that much in metal and silence. Wolfe leaned back. Bring in Owen Pike next. The school teacher. Yes, a broken engagement 2 weeks before murder is not decorative. And Leah, soon. But first, the man who stepped away. Outside, traffic moved on 35th Street with its usual indifference. Inside, the office felt tighter, more exact. The case had been all small humiliations once, a cabinet of quiet things and old embarrassments. Then it had become blood. Now it had found its first true listener, a man at a clock shop, a question too quickly asked, a pair of words burned almost away, and a workbench rattling under the grip of a respectable widower who had suddenly heard time running out. Chapter 7. The daughter who wasn't Leah Trent lived 3 blocks from her father's shop in a narrow apartment above a stationery store, the kind of place rented by people who still believe neat curtains and a polished kettle can keep confusion from entering. I went there with Wolfe at 4 in the afternoon, which in itself made the day memorable. Wolfe does not often climb stairs in pursuit of truth, unless the truth has already insulted him personally. "This had better be worth the ascent," he muttered on the second landing. "It is either that or philosophy," I said. "Bah!" Leah Trent opened the door herself. She had the same face as the photograph in the clock shop, only altered now by fatigue, not theatrical fatigue, not red eyes and wrung hands. Worse, she looked like someone who had been holding a roof up with bare hands for too many nights and had lost the energy even to tremble. Dark hair pulled back carelessly, plain blue dress, no ornament except a wristwatch too modest to matter. Her eyes went first to me, then to Wolfe, and in them there was no surprise at all. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "please, come in." That told me 2 things. First, she had expected us sooner or later. Second, she had decided something before we arrived. Her sitting room was small and clean and cheerless, in the way rooms get when their owner has recently stopped, caring whether flowers are worth replacing. Books on a side table sewing basket near the chair. 2 framed watercolors of river scenes. On the mantel stood a photograph of a man I took at once for Owen Pike. Thin face, earnest mouth, schoolteacher all over. The kind of man who probably used the word character without irony. Leah saw me glance at it. "I haven't put it away yet," she said. Wolfe lowered himself into the chair I had cleared for him and looked at her with that steady, unornamental attention of his that can feel kinder than sympathy and harsher than accusation. "Miss Trent," he said, "your father is frightened." She did not start. "Yes. He has reason. Yes. You do also." "That one," she answered after a moment. "I am tired, Mr. Wolfe. Fright takes energy." Wolfe grunted. "Good. Then perhaps you will save time by telling the truth." She sat opposite him and folded her hands in her lap. They were very still, which I noticed because the rest of her wasn't. Not outwardly, inwardly. The whole room had that sensation you get in a station when a train is approaching, but not yet visible. "At some point," she said, "the truth becomes only another form of damage. But perhaps damage has already had its turn." Wolfe's lids lowered a fraction. "Martin Vale told you something about your family?" "Yes." "When?" 2 weeks ago, before your engagement ended." "Yes. What did he tell you?" "He did not tell me the whole of it. That was his method. He never offered a wound cleanly. He preferred to loosen the bandage and let one imagine the rest." I made a note. "Though it was already a perfect description of Martin," Leah went on, "he sent for me. I went because I thought it concerned my father. Martin said there had been a deception in my family, one old enough that everyone involved had learned to call it history instead of lying. He said my mother had not told the truth about my birth." Wolfe asked. "His exact words?" "Not exact, near enough." "Did he mention paternity?" "Yes, obliquely. He said that some men raise children born to other men and never know whether the ignorance is mercy or theft." That was the kind of sentence Martin would have polished and reused like a silver spoon in poison. "What did you do?" Wolfe asked. "At first, nothing. I told him he was vile and left. Yet your engagement ended." Her mouth tightened. "Yes. Why?" She looked at the photograph on the mantel, then away from it, because Owen began asking questions. After speaking with Martin. Number before, or rather, Before speaking with him directly, he had received an unsigned note. I sat up a little. Wolfe did not, but I knew he had too. "What note?" he said. She rose, crossed to a drawer in the writing table, and took out an envelope, plain, cheap, handled too often. She gave it to me. Inside was a single sheet with a sentence typed in capitals. "Ask who was present at your birth before you marry her." No signature, no date. I handed it to Wolfe. He looked at it, then at her. "Owen Pike received this." "Yes, about 3 weeks ago, and brought it to you." Number he went first to Martin. Why? Because Martin had known my mother, and because on this street, whenever people wish to learn something ugly without seeming to seek ugliness, they drift to Martin like smoke. That was true enough to sting. Martin confirmed the note. Wolfe asked. Not fully, but enough. Enough to make Owen come to me with questions I could not answer. What questions? Whether my mother had left any letters, whether my father was in town the week I was born, whether there had ever been talk of my being early. She gave a dry laugh with no mirth in it. I did not know one could feel ashamed of one's own birth until then. No, Wolfe said, one should not. But humans are inventive. She sat again. I asked my father. He denied there was anything to tell. I asked again. He became angry, not loud. My father does not shout, he tightens. Then I went back to Martin and demanded the truth. He wouldn't give it. He said it was not his to tell complete, only his to verify if asked properly. That was when your engagement ended. Yes. Owen said he could not marry into uncertainty. Her face did not change, but her voice did, just once. He said a marriage ought not to begin under a question mark. I told him people begin under worse punctuation every day. That nearly got me. Wolfe only grunted. Did Owen ever learn more than Martin chose to imply? He asked. I don't know. He saw Martin once more, the week before the murder. After that he was gentler to me but more distant, which was somehow worse. Did Martin ask anything of you in exchange for this information? Number. Nothing. She met his eyes. He enjoyed it, Mr. Wolfe. That was his price. There it was, the whole rotten mechanism in one sentence. Wolfe's gaze shifted briefly to the photograph of Owen Pike and back. On Tuesday, the day of the murder, did you see Martin? Number, did you go to his house? Number, did your father? I don't know. Miss Trent, if you are not Elias Trent's daughter, she cut in, not sharply but with exhaustion so complete it sounded like age. If I am not, then my mother carried that lie for decades. Then my father, whether he knew or not, built his whole life around it. Then every birthday cake, every school prize, every illness he sat through, every clock he repaired to pay for my books, belongs partly to a false story. Do you understand what that does to a person? It does not merely alter a fact, it poisons memory. Wolfe's face did not soften. It became, if possible, more exact. No, he said, not poisons tests. Memory remains. Meaning shifts. She stared at him. That distinction, he said, is why you are enduring this better than Mr. Pike. I almost turned to look at him. Leah did instead. Owen was not cruel, she said. No, Wolfe said. Only weak in a tidy way. He wished certainty more than devotion. It is common. She lowered her head once, a movement so slight it might have been assent or simply fatigue. Perhaps. I asked, did Martin tell you who might know the full truth? She was silent a moment. He mentioned a woman named Ada Mercer. He said old streets preserve old women and old facts equally well. I assumed he was taunting me. That one I filed. Wolfe asked the next question, as if setting down a piece in chess. Did Martin possess any document? I think so. What? I don't know. He had an envelope in his hand while he spoke to me. He tapped it against his knee, thick paper inside. Did he show it? Number, did he name it? Number only said that proof outlives decency. Again Martin Wolfe rose, which ended the interview more effectively than thanks would have. At the door, Leah said, "Mr. Wolfe." He turned. "If the truth is what it seems, and if my father knew, will you tell me?" "Yes." "And if he did not?" "Yes." She nodded. "Then there is no kind version?" "No," Wolfe said. "Only an accurate one." On the stairs down, Wolfe moved in silence until we reached the sidewalk. Then he stopped, planted his cane, and looked west as if New York had personally arranged the weather to annoy him. "Well," I said. He was sitting smugly atop a grief mine. "That's one for the scrapbook. It is exact. Shame can be negotiated. Petty disgrace can be endured, hidden, laughed off, or bartered. But uncertainty of blood, especially after decades, explodes backward as well as forward. It fractures courtship, parenthood, inheritance, self-respect, memory, everything. So Martin had the one thing in his cabinet that wasn't a trophy. Yes, the rest were specimens. This was dynamite. We walked half a block before I said, "Owen Pike got the unsigned note. Could Martin have sent it?" "Certainly." "Why?" "To set events in motion, to provoke inquiry, to watch." "That's sick." "Yes." I thought of Leah in that little room, too tired even for fear. If Elias Trent knew, he had motive. If he knew and Martin pressed him, yes. And if he didn't know, then he still had motive once he suspected Martin could expose it. Wolfe's eyes narrowed, but do not become vulgar and settle too early. We still lack sequence. The note to Pike, Martin's interview with Leah, the broken engagement, the confrontation overheard by Ada Mercer, the burned papers, the missing envelope. Each is placed, but not yet locked. Who sent the note then? Wolfe made a sound. That is one question. A better one is, who benefited from Owen Pike asking first? That kept me busy all the way home. By dinner the case had shifted again in my head. The cabinet on Riddle Street no longer resembled a collection of confessions at all. It looked like camouflage Martin had built around one dangerous core. A brooch, a pawn ticket, a report card, a hotel key, junk, all of it, useful mainly because it made the fatal envelope seem ordinary by association. Leah Trent had not looked frightened. She had looked exhausted, the way people look when the facts have not yet killed them, but have already crushed the furniture of life. If she was not Elias Trent's daughter, then her dead mother had left behind more than a memory. She had left a delayed explosion. And Martin Vale, with his neat labels and dead man's amusements, had been sitting on top of it for years, smiling. Chapter 8. The Teacher with the Torn Cuff. A man may look guilty for reasons entirely unrelated to murder. By Tuesday morning, Owen Pike looked guilty enough to satisfy 3 policemen, a district attorney, and an aunt with principles. He received me in a furnished room on West 58th Street, on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled of boiled cabbage, damp newspapers, and educational failure. Schoolteachers rarely earn enough to live among their virtues. Pike's room was neat, underheated, and full of books arranged with an earnestness that made me tired before I sat down. Latin grammars, histories, school editions of Shakespeare, and 1 volume of essays with slips of paper, marking passages no woman had ever wanted to hear quoted over supper. Owen Pike himself was 30 or thereabout, tall, narrow, spectacles, serious mouth. The kind of face that might improve if it ever forgot to be correct. His cuff was torn at the right wrist, not freshly, but not old enough to be accidental in the story. His eyes were red, rimmed from bad sleep, not drink. "Yes," he said. "Archie Goodwin, Nero Wolfe." That got him. Not because of fame, because by then anyone within range of Martin Vale's death knew that Wolfe meant the matter had stopped being local. He let me in. I sat. He remained standing a moment too long, then sat too, and folded his hands between his knees, as if conducting himself before a board. "You were engaged to Leah Trent," I said. "Yes." "Where?" "Yes, because Martin Vale put a question into the middle of it. He looked at the floor once and back up, among other things. Such as the fact that when one asks a direct question and receives only injury in reply, one begins to suspect There are more direct questions needed. That was schoolteacher talk for confusion wearing a collar. You got an unsigned note. Yes. Showed it to Martin. Yes. Why him? Because everyone in that neighborhood knew he had a grotesque talent for remembering old facts. Grotesque is good. What happened? He took off his spectacles, polished them, and put them back on, which I understood as a ritual for buying time. At first he denied knowing anything definite. Then he began speaking in implications. He said I ought to ask who attended Leah's mother in confinement. He asked whether I had ever noticed that Elias Trent disliked family anniversaries. He hinted that certain names on a birth record may satisfy law without satisfying truth. Did he say Leah wasn't Trent's daughter? Not in those words. Not then. Latter. His jaw tightened. Later, yes. I let that breathe. When later, Tuesday evening, the night he died. That made the room a little smaller. You saw him that night? Yes. At his house? Yes. What time? A little before 5. Inside. Number at the door first, then in the hall, you argued. Yes. Loudly. Yes. The one he claimed held the proof. Proof of what? That Leah's mother had concealed the truth of Leah's birth, that Elias Trent was not her father, or might not be. Martin was maddeningly careful even when being cruel. I looked at the torn cuff. And you asked for it? Yes. He refused. Yes. Why? Because he said, I had no standing. That sounded like Martin too. But there was more. I waited. Pike gave it. He said. Owen continued. And now his voice changed from weary to bitter imitation. The father deserves to know before the daughter does. That hit cleanly, I said, exact words. As nearly as memory can hold them, I remember because I wanted to strike him. Did you? Number. Then the cuff. He looked at it as if I had just introduced him. He caught my sleeve when I reached past him. To get the envelope, yes. And then. He laughed. Pike's face actually altered with the memory, not rage exactly, but the humiliation of being made ridiculous. He said if I married Leah on uncertainty, I was a fool. And if I refused to marry her for lack of certainty, I was worse than a fool. That was a line Martin might have saved for years waiting to spend. Did he tell you where the envelope was? Number only that it existed, and that he would decide who saw it, and when. Then you left. Yes. Why? Because I was afraid that if I stayed, I would do something ugly, such as kill him. He met that directly, which was to his credit. Number strike him, perhaps. I am not a violent man, Mr. Goodwin. Those are often the men who say that before hitting someone. He let it pass. I left. Seen by anyone. Yes, the baker at the corner was unloading flour from a truck. He saw me come out. I nearly collided with one of the men carrying sacks. That was useful and later proved true. I went straight from Pike's room to the corner bakery and found the driver and his helper willing to remember a tall, thin man with spectacles and a torn cuff coming away from Vale's house before 5. Looking sick enough to justify collision. Time according to them about 4:50 or a minute after. Early enough to argue, early enough to want murder. Too early, probably, to have done it if the doctor's estimate held and Ada Mercer's overheard voices came after. But the valuable thing was not the alibi. It was the sentence. Back in the office on 35th Street, Wolfe took it without visible excitement, which is how he shows excitement when it matters. Pete, precisely, he said. Martin refused to hand over the envelope because the father deserves to know before the daughter does. Wolfe closed his eyes. I waited. When Wolfe closes his eyes after a sentence, either he is thinking hard or you have become uninteresting. In this case, it was the first. Archie, he said finally, the axis has shifted. From lover to parent. Yes, Owen Pike's motive was anger at deception, but it was outward, interrogative. He wanted answers, not silence. He said that himself. And more importantly, his actions support it. He demanded the envelope. A killer who seeks silence does not ask openly for evidence in advance, tear his cuff in a public quarrel, and depart seen by bakers. You don't think he came back? Number possible, but inelegant. Also, Ada Mercer heard a low, pleading voice, and a sharp, hurt one. Pike is not low, and pleading at such a moment. He is stiff and moralizing. That's fair. Wolfe opened his eyes. Martin's sentence is decisive. If he truly said, "The father deserves to know before the daughter does," then he had adopted the role of arbiter in a family revelation. Abominable. But instructive. The person most endangered by the envelope was not the fiancé but the father, either because he knew and feared disclosure, or did not know and feared learning it. Elias Trent. Yes, or conceivably another father, if parentage has doubled back on us, but Trent first. I sat and lit a cigarette. I didn't especially want. Pike also said Martin was careful. Not even with proof would he state things cleanly, because ambiguity prolonged his importance. A clear confession ends utility. That was exactly Martin. He hadn't wanted truth. He had wanted custody of truth. I gave Wolfe the rest of Pike's account. Owen had received the anonymous typed note. He had gone first to Martin because Martin was known to know old stories. Martin had hinted enough to poison the engagement, then refused to produce the actual document. On Tuesday night, Owen returned in anger, demanding to see the missing envelope. Martin denied him on the ground that the father should know first. They struggled briefly at the door or in the hall. Martin tore his cuff. Owen left, seen by the flower men. No murder yet, only damage in progress. Wolfe listened, and then asked, did Pike say whether Martin named the father? Number only, the father. Traffic sounded from outside, and from somewhere in the house came the faint, reliable clink of Fritz handling silver, as if it were a moral duty. Wolfe drummed his fingers once on the chair arm. Martin Vale, he said, had at last obtained what he had always lacked, an object whose value did not lie in embarrassment but in sequence. Who should know first, father or daughter? That is not the question of a blackmailer. It is the question of a meddler enthroned. Enthroned may be too high, obviously. I thought of Pike's room, the torn cuff, the books all in order, because life wasn't. He's not our man. Number not unless everyone else becomes impossible, which they have not. A jilted lover is dramatic, and therefore usually wrong. That'll disappoint Rocliffe. Good. He leaned forward. Now attend. Pike's statement does two things. It removes primary suspicion from him, and it confirms that the missing envelope was still in Martin's possession Tuesday evening, after the engagement had already broken, and after Leah had been told enough to suffer. So someone got to Martin after Pike left, and before Julia Riddle found the body. Yes, someone for whom the envelope meant not inquiry, but catastrophe. The parent. Just so. That locked it in my head with a click almost as neat as one of Elias Trent's repaired clocks. Up to then, the case had dangled conveniently around Owen Pike, earnest man, damaged pride, public argument, torn cuff, motive enough for newspaper men. But his anger ran toward knowledge, not concealment. He had wanted the envelope handed over. He had wanted fact, however ugly, because he still believed facts cure things. That is the schoolteacher's error. The killer, on the other hand, had wanted the envelope gone. That narrowed the field brutally. Not the lover demanding answers, the parent dreading them. And in Martin Vale's smug sentence, the father deserves to know before the daughter does. There was the whole rotten arrangement. Martin had not merely stored a secret. He had staged its revelation, timed its detonation, and put himself in the center chair as master of ceremony. It was enough to make a decent man kill him, or an indecent one. And by then Wolfe, though he had not yet said it aloud, had begun to know which kind he was dealing with. Chapter 9. The secret inside the secret. Wolfe did not send me to Elias Trent the second time. He went himself. That was not generosity. It was tactics. When Wolfe wishes to accuse a man, he often sends me. When he wishes to leave a man one final chance to remain human, he goes in person, carrying his mass, his silence, and his terrible gift for making refusal feel childish. So on Wednesday afternoon, with March light lying grey and thin on the city, like old tin, we crossed to the clock shop together. I had the sense, not new, but always unpleasant, that the case had already tipped past investigation and into arrangement. Wolfe was no longer fishing. He was selecting the net. Ilias Trent was at his bench again, though I doubted he had repaired anything all day. The little tins of screws were aligned. 3 clock movements lay open. A regulator clicked with virtuous steadiness from the wall. But the man himself looked as if he had spent the night holding arguments with the dark and losing none of them. When he saw Wolfe enter, something in his face settled. Not fear exactly, recognition. A man knows when the hour has arrived, even in a room full of clocks. "Mr. Wolfe," he said. Wolfe inclined his head. "Mr. Trent, if you have any regard for your daughter, you will tell the truth now." That landed cleanly. No preface. No upholstery. Trent's hand moved once over the bench top, not gripping as before, merely resting there to feel wood instead of air. "I have told no lies worth the name," he said. Wolfe grunted. "Sir, most lies are not worth the name. They are merely evasions dressed for church. Sit down." There was a chair near the back. Trent sat. I remained standing by the door because sometimes a room needs a witness more than a participant. The ticking went on all around us, small mechanical insistences measuring out the conversation before it had happened. Wolfe did not sit. He stood a moment with his cane planted, looking at Trent as if considering a difficult orchid that had somehow acquired a conscience. "You knew," he said, "years ago, that Leah was not your daughter by blood." Trent shut his eyes. That was answer enough for one point, but Wolfe was just beginning. "You knew," he repeated. "And you raised her as your own. Your wife told you before she died, or near enough. She begged you to let the truth be buried with her. You agreed. Not out of weakness, but out of love, for the child, perhaps even for the woman who had wronged you. Since then you have lived as Leah's father in every way that matters, which is to say in all the ways except one vulgar biological detail. Martin Vale learned of it recently, and he used that knowledge as a torment. Is any of this false?" For a long half-minute the only sound in the shop was ticking, not steady now, nervous. Every clock seemed to have found a slightly different heartbeat, and together they made a chorus of private strain. At last Trent opened his eyes. They were dry. Men like Ilias Trent do not weep easily. They calcify instead. "No," he said. "It is not false." Wolfe nodded once without triumph. "Good, now. Say it yourself." Trent looked down at his hands, long-fingered and careful even in defeat. "My wife, Clara, was ill after Leah was born. Not dying then. That came later. But there was fever, confusion, the doctor coming and going, and afterward she was changed. Not always enough." He swallowed. "Years later, when she knew she would not recover the second time, she told me. I kept still." Wolfe said nothing. Silence is one of his more expensive tools. "She said Leah might not be mine," Trent went on. "No, she said more than that. She said she believed Leah was not mine. There had been, before the birth, a stupidity, a weakness. Call it what you like. A man from outside the neighborhood. Temporary, shameful, finished before it had even properly begun. She said she had hoped the dates favored me, then she had hoped never to know, then she had hoped to die without telling me. In the end she told me because she could not bear to take the lie entirely with her." His voice remained level, but the levelness itself had become a wound. "And you?" Wolfe asked. "I did what husbands do when truth arrives too late to be useful." Trent gave a small, appalling smile. "I asked whether she had loved him. She said no." As if that could balance arithmetic. "No," Wolfe said. "It cannot. I asked whether she was certain. She said no one could be certain now, but she feared it. Feared it enough that she had feared Leah herself in the crib. not because of the child, but because of what she might mean. Then she begged me, to leave it buried. He lifted his head. What was I to do, Mr. Wolfe? Send for a blood oracle, announce to a child of 12 that I had become statistical. Leah was mine because I had raised her, because I knew the way she frowned when reading, because I sat awake through her croup, because I made toys from clock springs when there was no money for shop. Bought nonsense. If blood wished to object, it had been absent at the important times. Wolfe's eyes flickered, not with softness, but with assent. Yes, that one syllable did more good than comfort would have. Trent drew breath. So I kept silent. Clara died. Leah grew. The question shrank, not because it was answered, but because life is stronger than theory when given enough years. Yes, until Martin. Wolfe moved at last and lowered himself into the chair I had cleared near the bench. How did he learn? I do not know exactly. Pieces perhaps. My wife was treated for the fever at a small clinic on 9th Avenue that no longer exists. There would have been forms. Dates, someone may have spoken, or perhaps he found a letter. Clara kept too much paper and destroyed too little. Martin once said, "The dead are untidy archivists." That sounded so precisely like Martin that I disliked him anew. Did he have proof? Wolfe asked. Yes. What sort? Trent shut his eyes again, but only for a second. An old clinic record, I think. Not full, not official in the modern sense, but enough. There was a notation about expected confinement dates that did not align with my return from Philadelphia that spring, and a letter Clara's hand, though perhaps unfinished, perhaps never sent. Martin showed me only a fragment, a sentence. Something about, if the child is not Elias's. His mouth worked once. And arithmetic of dates, as he called it. He enjoyed the phrase. The shop seemed colder, Wolfe said. He kept the material in an envelope. Yes, in the unlabeled drawer. I believe so, and he refused to surrender it. Trent laughed once without mirth. Refused. He cherished it. Mr. Wolfe, those other envelopes of his, the brooches and pawn tickets and petty disgraces, were rubbish to him after this. This one mattered. I think it was the only secret he had ever touched that made him feel grand. That fitted so well it was obscene. Martin Vale, collector of small collapses, finally in possession of a tragedy worth kneeling over. Wolfe spoke quietly. He had once loved your wife. That made Trent stare. You know that. I know Martin. Or rather, I know his type when it ripens. He preserved your wife's photograph for 20 years. He kept no others visible. He visited the memory of her through the fact of her lie. That is the secret inside the secret, Mr. Trent. He did not merely enjoy your pain. He transformed it into a private relic of power because he had loved her and possessed nothing else of consequence. Trent's face changed. Not surprise, recognition arriving late. Yes, he whispered. Yes, I think. Perhaps I knew without naming it. He loved her in silence, Wolfe said. She married you. Years later he learned she had deceived you, to a diseased vanity that becomes treasure. He can't have the woman, can't have the life. But he can possess the hidden fracture in it. So he kept it, not for money, for superiority. The clocks ticked on. Trent looked older by 10 years than when we had entered, but also oddly less burdened, as if precision, even cruel precision, had relieved him of some duty to invent. What happened Tuesday evening? Wolfe asked. Trent answered at once, which meant he had already surrendered the point to himself. I went to plead. There are some words that improve a room by being plain. Plead was one of them. I knew by then that Leah had been told something. She would not meet my eyes. Pike had been to see Martin. I could feel the whole wretched thing loosening in the house like plaster after rain, so I went across. At what time? Shortly after that schoolmaster left, I saw him come out. Ah, I said. Yes. I waited a minute, then went in. You found Martin in the back room? Yes. Alone. Yes, what did you say? That he must give me the envelope. That whatever Clara had done, whatever I had borne, Leah must be spared public cruelty. That if there was truth to be told, I would tell it or not tell it. But he had no right to sit with it like a spider. Wolfe nodded, and he smiled. Trent's hand tightened on the chair arm. He said, rights had nothing to do with it. He said, some truths acquire value by waiting. He said, Leah should not hear from him. No, but neither should I imagine I could dictate terms after profiting from ignorance for 24 years. Profiting, Wolfe muttered. The swine. Yes. Then he said, Clara had trusted me less than she feared me, and that perhaps she had been wise. That hung in the air like poison, I said quietly. And then Trent did not answer at once. One of the wall clocks struck the quarter, with a faint prim note, absurdly well-bred. I told him, Trent said, that if he had ever cared for Clara, he would stop. He laughed again. He said caring is what had preserved it. Wolfe's face did not move, but his eyes hardened. Then grief turned. Yes. How did you strike him? With the brass case of a carriage clock. He glanced toward a shelf, not at the weapon itself, but at its species. It was on Martin's side table beside the chair. I did not bring anything. I took what was near. One blow. Yes. He fell. Yes. And then I stood there. The words were almost toneless now. I do not know how long. Then I saw the drawer open. I knew the envelope would be there. I took it. And burned it. Partly downstairs first, in panic. Then I found there was another paper with it. A copy, perhaps, or Clara's letter fragment. And I took that upstairs and burned it in the grate. I do not know why I used two places, because I was no longer thinking, because the first fire seemed too visible, because destruction, once begun, breeds stupidity. That was true enough to need no polishing. The glass Ada Mercer heard, Wolfe asked. A tumbler, I knocked it from the desk, and the soft front door. Trent looked at him with dead weariness. I had been a respectable man all my life, Mr. Wolfe. Even after murder, habit remained. No one spoke for several seconds, then Wolfe rose. When he stood at full height in that cramped shop among the half-dissected clocks, he seemed too large for mechanics and exactly the right size for judgment. You killed Martin Vale, he said. Not because he possessed the truth, but because he profaned grief. Trent bowed his head. Yes. And because you feared for Leah. Yes. And because you loved her without qualification. At that Trent's mouth trembled once, the first visible break in him. Yes, Wolfe turned to me. Archie, call Inspector Kramer. I moved to the telephone on the side shelf, but Trent said, one request. Wolfe stopped. Leah, Trent said, she must hear it from me if there is any mercy left in the world. Wolfe looked at him for a long moment. You should have told her years ago if you intended ever to do so. But yes, I will allow the sequence. That was Wolfe's version of mercy, sharpened into certainty, paired of all softness, and offered only where structure required it. As I dialed Kramer, the clocks kept ticking, broken mechanisms on benches, springs under tension, hands moving toward their appointed marks. And in the middle of them Elias Trent sat with the look of a man who had spent 24 years holding a life together, and in 5 minutes with Martin Vale had shattered his own to protect it. The secret Martin kept had never been merely that Leah was not Trent's daughter by blood. The real secret inside the secret was uglier and smaller and more like him. He had loved Clara in silence. He had treasured the proof of her lie because it gave him the only power he had ever possessed over the life she chose instead of him. And, when Elias came, not in anger but in grief, asking for the envelope as one man asks another for human decency, Martin refused. He did worse than refuse. He pressed the wound deeper and called it truth. That was enough. Chapter 10. The cabinet emptied. Inspector Kramer arrived at the brownstone that evening with Sergeant Rowcliffe, 2 plainclothes men, and the expression of a man who had expected annoyance, and found instead that annoyance had been organized for him in advance. Wolfe was in the office behind his desk, having eaten well, and therefore being at his most judicial. I was at my desk with notes, names, times, and one ash fragment sealed in an envelope. Fritz had closed the door between the hall and dining room with a firmness that announced his opinion of policemen in general and of police activity near clean silver in particular. Kramer sat in the red leather chair and scowled at Wolfe. "Well?" Wolfe steepled his fingers. "Mr. Elias Trent killed Martin Vale." Rowcliffe shifted, not from surprise but from irritation that the sentence had not come from him. Kramer merely grunted. "You've got more than one sentence, I hope." "Many more. Mr. Goodwin will give you the sequence after I state the essentials, since he enjoys the sound of his own competence." "That'll be a novelty," I said. Wolfe ignored me. "Trent has confessed to me and to Archie, though not yet in your formal presence. He struck Vale in the back room of the house on Riddle Street with a brass clock key taken from his pocket." Kramer's head moved. "Clock case?" "Yes, the brass case of a small carriage clock, heavy enough to crush the temple, common enough in Trent's trade, and near at hand in a room where such things had lately been shown or discussed. He seized what was closest. That fit beautifully, and I was annoyed Wolfe had saved it for Kramer instead of giving it to me sooner," he went on. He had gone to Val not to protect vanity, not to save himself social inconvenience, but to protect Leah Trent. Val had been tormenting the family with documentary evidence, suggesting that Leah was not Trent's daughter by blood. He had already hinted as much to Leah and to Owen Pike, whose engagement to her had collapsed under the strain. Kramer's eyes narrowed. What evidence? A clinic form, a fragment of a letter from Leah's mother, and certain arithmetic of dates. The complete envelope was taken by Trent after the killing and burned. Not completely, however. A remnant survived in the upstairs grate, the words, "Not his daughter." That fragment, combined with witness statements and Vale's own behavior, established the nature of the secret. Rowcliffe spoke. "That's not enough for murder." Wolfe turned his head and looked at him as one might look at a stain. "Number it is enough for the motive. The act came later." I gave Kramer the rest in proper order. Owen Pike had received an unsigned typed note telling him to ask about Leah's birth before marrying her. Pike had gone to Martin Vale for clarification. Vale, relishing his role, had confirmed enough to infect the engagement without surrendering the proof. Leah had then confronted Vale, and later her father. Elias Trent, who had known for years that Leah might not be his by blood, but had raised her as his daughter in every way that mattered, saw the buried grief of a lifetime being dragged into daylight for Martin's pleasure. "He went over there after Pike left," I said. "Pike was seen leaving by the flower men at the corner. Trent saw him come out, waited, then went in himself." Kramer nodded slowly. Ada Mercer heard voices. "Yes, one low and pleading, one sharp with hurt, and Martin saying, 'You should have told him yourself.' That wasn't blackmail talk. That was Martin presiding over a family wound like a judge who had bought his robe second-hand," Wolfe added. "When Trent begged for the envelope, Vale refused to surrender it. He said the father deserved to know before the daughter did. But by then the father already knew. What Vale meant was that he, Vale, would dictate the order of disclosure. He had transformed grief into property." Kramer's mouth tightened. He doesn't often show pity, but he can smell desecration. "And the strike," he asked, "came when Vale mocked the years of fatherhood, as if they were make-believe," I said. "Trent had gone to plead, not bluster, but Vale pressed the wound too far." Wolfe nodded. "The oldest sorrows do not often shout. They harden, endure, and then, if insulted at the precise point of sacrifice, they break all at once." Kramer stood. "Where's Trent now?" "In his shop," I said, "waiting." Rowcliffe moved first, eager to resume his natural state of pursuit, but Kramer stopped him with a hand. "I'll do the talking." They went. The house became quiet again except for traffic and the faint clink from the kitchen where Fritz, hearing departure, had probably forgiven justice in principle. Wolfe leaned back and closed his eyes. I looked at him. "You might have told me sooner about the clock key." I had no certainty until Trent spoke. A brass clock case, a key, a tool from the bench, All were possible. The key satisfied elegance. Nice for the corpse. Confound the corpse. An hour later, Kramer telephoned. Trent had confessed without trouble and with less drama than Rowcliffe found satisfying. That fitted. Men like Elias Trent do not perform repentance. They state it. Kramer said the key had been found in a drawer beneath cleaning cloths. Wiped, but not successfully enough for chemistry, and that Trent had given them the rest plainly. He had taken the envelope and burned it in 2 places, downstairs and upstairs, trying first to destroy proof and then to destroy even the remains of proof. But panic had no more discipline in him than in any other man. After Wolfe hung up, there was nothing left to do except understand it all the way through, which is what he likes best anyway. So, at my request, and for my education, he did what he always does when the game is over. He arranged the truth until it stood upright. Martin Vale, he said, spent years collecting petty confessions because they gave him influence without open risk. He was too timid or too refined, depending on one's appetite for euphemism, to become a vulgar extortionist. Instead, he accumulated emotional leverage. A brooch pawned in secret, a forged age, stolen cemetery flowers, trifles, all of them embarrassments, survivable. He kept them because they allowed him to remain present in other people's weakness. The trophy keeper, I said. Yes, then, by chance or persistence, he obtained something different. Not a trifle, not a social abrasion. A hidden fracture in a family, evidence that Leah Trent was not Elias Trent's daughter by blood. And because he had once loved Clara Trent. Wolfe opened one eye. Exactly. That made it precious to him. The others were specimens. This was personal. It gave him retrospective possession over a life he had not been chosen for. Disgusting, but psychologically ordinary. That's your warm side. He ignored it. He sent or caused the anonymous note to Owen Pike. He wanted movement. He wanted the question alive. When Pike asked, Vale confirmed enough to wound, but not enough to conclude. Then Leah came, then Pike again, then Trent. Each interview increased Vale's importance. He sat atop the secret like a fat child on a chest of stolen toys. And finally got hit. Yes, because he mistook pain for curiosity. He assumed that because he enjoyed preserving sorrow in envelopes, others would endure its handling indefinitely. I got up and crossed to the window. 35th Street was wet with evening, reflecting lights in broken strips. New York looked its usual self, busy, indifferent, and full of windows behind which people were hiding facts, too small for headlines and too large for peace. Funny thing, I said. In the end, he wasn't killed for exposing crime, theft, or corruption. He was killed because he treated a family's misery like a collectible. Wolfe grunted. That is not funny. It is common. The next morning, we received word that Leah Trent had been told by her father before formal charges were filed. I never learned the exact words and didn't want to. Some speeches deserve privacy, even in a city where privacy mostly survives as architecture. Owen Pike sent a note of withdrawal, not from the case, there was nothing to withdraw from, but from the engagement permanently, with language so careful it made me want to strike him on educational grounds. Leah, Fritz reported after overhearing Wolfe on the telephone, had answered with more steadiness than anyone had a right to expect. And Martin Vale's cabinet, that was emptied. The police took the envelopes, the brooches, the report cards, the faded tickets, the oddments and relics, all the neat little parcels of shame he had stacked like a private museum. Most of them would be returned if owners could be identified and still wanted them. Some would be destroyed. A few would probably rot in evidence lockers until New York collapsed into rust. The cabinet itself, once stripped, would be only walnut and brass and empty compartments. The shell of a dead man's appetite. I thought about it longer than Wolfe did. He had already moved on to a dispute with a grower in New Jersey about the handling of cattleyas in cold weather, which, for him, was not indifference but recovery. As for me, I kept seeing that room on Riddle Street as I had first seen it. Shelves, drawers, labeled envelopes, a room made for hush, a museum of quiet things, but the quiet had been false. Every object in that cabinet had once belonged to a moment when someone had feared being known too clearly. Martin had preserved those fears and called it order. The missing envelope had told Wolfe the only truth in the room that wasn't small. Not his daughter. 3 words left by a bad fire and a worse man. And that was enough. In the end, Elias Trent confessed without ceremony, which is how the deepest griefs generally speak. No excuses, no ranting, no elaborate self-defense. He had gone to Martin Vale to protect Leah from becoming a question mark in her own life. He had asked for decency. Martin had answered with relish. He had mocked the long years of fatherhood as if blood could cancel habit, tenderness, sacrifice, bedtime, fever, work, memory, as if raising a child were a costume and not a life. Then Trent struck him with the brass case of the carriage clock at hand. One blow, one dead collector, one cabinet less full. Wolfe, looking back on it, said only this: on such streets, Archie, the smallest secrets are often the most murderous. Not because they are largest in law, but because they lie nearest the roots. Men will survive disgrace, debt, adultery, theft, and ridicule, but touch their claim to belonging, to who is theirs, and to whom they are bound, and you reach the oldest violence. That was good enough to keep. Riddle Street went back to its business. Curtains half drawn, shops open, deliveries made, people carrying parcels, lies, dinners, umbrellas, and old mistakes. New York never pauses, long over one corpse unless the corpse obstructs traffic. But I remembered Martin Vale's house after the police had finished with it. The cabinet open and bare, the drawers gaping like extracted teeth. The room no longer sinister, but merely sad. He had spent years gathering tiny human failures as if they were coins or stamps. He had believed possession conferred understanding. It didn't, and when he finally laid hands on a secret that mattered, he handled it the same way he had handled all the rest, neatly, smugly, and without mercy. That was why he died. Not for uncovering sin, not for defending truth, not for justice of any known brand. He died because he saw a family's pain and mistook it for an interesting object. On Riddle Street, that was error enough.